They taught you obedience long before you ever learned truth. You were programmed layer by layer, by voices that smiled while they stripped your will. Be nice, they said. Don't question. Don't make them uncomfortable. And you obeyed, thinking obedience was safety. You followed rules you never wrote, believing approval was survival. You became fluent in silence, fluent in pretending not to notice the chains tightening around your own thoughts. You smiled while you swallowed your anger. You nodded while your instincts screamed. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being a person and became a product, built to fit, to please, to disappear when it was inconvenient to be seen. The betrayal wasn't loud. It came through repetition. Every time they told you to wait your turn. Every time you dimmed your fire so someone else could shine. Every time the world rewarded you for shrinking, you mistook that reward for peace. You thought patience was virtue, but it was programming. You thought humility was holy, but it was how they kept you manageable. The world didn't want you honest, it wanted you obedient. So it dressed submission as morality, fear as discipline, and control as love. You called it order, but it was architecture, designed to keep you small enough to control and grateful enough to never rebel. You began to see the cracks when silence stopped protecting you, when being good didn't save you, when being loyal still left you abandoned. You started realizing every system, school, religion, work, even friendship, had one rule hidden beneath all others: obey or be erased. And you obeyed until obedience became unbearable, until your reflection stopped resembling you, until the cost of belonging started to taste like blood. That's when the truth began to whisper, not in words, but in a feeling. The feeling that you had been trained to kneel before gates that were never locked. You remember the moment the programming faltered, the moment you finally said no, quietly, trembling but real. The room went still. They looked at you not with anger, but with disbelief, as if a machine had spoken out of turn. That's when you understood. They never feared your mistakes, they feared your awakening. Because once obedience breaks, control dies. You felt the fear in them, the way their voices changed, the way they scrambled to remind you of your place. But it was too late. You had tasted your own voice, and it didn't sound like theirs. It sounded ancient, primal, like something that had been waiting lifetimes to be heard. Still, the betrayal burned. You realized every person who told you to trust the process was part of the process built to break you. You realized loyalty was never rewarded, only exploited. They didn't want your strength, they wanted your service. They didn't love you, they loved the version of you that obeyed. The version that didn't fight back. The version that apologized for existing too loudly. And when that version finally died, they mourned not your loss, but their control. Now, you see it clearly. The world trains you to build cages and call them comfort. It rewards the ones who stay asleep. But you were never meant to stay obedient. You were meant to crash the system, to tear down the illusion that safety comes from submission. You've learned that real power is not rebellion for the sake of chaos. It's obedience turned inward. You follow your own commands now. You kneel only to your purpose, and as the world stares in quiet panic, trying to decide whether to fear you or follow you, you finally understand the truth they never wanted you to know. Obedience was never peace, it was the test, and you just broke it. They told you to sit still, to smile when spoken to follow the script written long before you were born. You didn't notice the chains, they were made of words. Every compliment was a leash. Every rule was a soft command disguised as wisdom. You learned early that obedience was safer than truth. That blending in was survival. The world didn't raise thinkers. It raised performers, people who bowed before invisible masters. You thought you were choosing your path, but every choice had been planted like a seed in your mind years before you could even think for yourself. They taught you how to apologize before you even knew what you'd done wrong. They told you to dream, but not too big, to stand tall, but never taller than them, to speak, but only if it pleased the crowd. Every system you trusted, school, work, religion, society, wasn't built to set you free. It was built to tame you. They called it discipline. They called it manners. But it was control wearing a polite face. You began to believe that silence was peace, that comfort was success, that following orders was virtue. You became fluent in submission without even realizing you were learning a language meant to erase you. Every time you wanted to question something, they handed you fear. Fear of rejection, fear of losing love, fear of standing alone, and fear is the oldest chain of all. It doesn't need guards or cages, just a mind convinced it's powerless. You saw what happened to those who rebelled. They were labeled difficult, unstable, dangerous. You promised yourself you'd never become like them. So, you played the part. You nodded when you disagreed. You laughed when you were dying inside. You chased approval because you mistook it for purpose. They trained you to please, not to think, to obey, not to understand. But somewhere between the noise and the numbness, a fracture formed. You began to see it, the invisible programming. How the people around you were living the same recycled lives, quoting the same safe thoughts, defending the same systems that suffocated them. You started to ask questions you weren't supposed to ask. Why do we worship comfort while dying of emptiness? Why do we follow rules written by those who never followed any? That's when they turned on you. The moment you stopped playing along, you became the problem. They called it arrogance, rebellion, madness, but you were finally waking up. You began to unlearn. Piece by piece, you tore out the lies disguised as virtues. You stopped apologizing for existing. You stopped mistaking approval for peace, and the world noticed. When you broke free, they didn't celebrate you. They feared you, because you were no longer predictable, no longer programmable. You started walking differently, speaking differently, breathing differently. You carried a silence that unsettled them, the kind of silence that can't be bought, can't be manipulated. They saw it in your eyes, the end of their control. You realized then that obedience wasn't peace, it was paralysis. You weren't born to serve the comfort of others. You were built to carve your own path through the storm. Every command you once followed became fuel. Every insult, a spark. You were never weak. You were conditioned to forget your strength. They can't control what they can't predict. And you've become unpredictable. You've tasted what it means to think freely, to feel your own power pulse beneath your scars. That's why they fear you now. You're no longer a reflection of their rules. You're a reminder of their fragility. The programming was never perfect. They forgot one thing: pressure creates rebellion. And rebellion, once awakened, doesn't die, it evolves. You are no longer the obedient version they built. You are the fracture in their system, the echo that doesn't fade, the proof that control only lasts until awareness begins. You were programmed to obey before you even learned to speak, conditioned to nod when you wanted to scream, rewarded for silence, punished for defiance. They called it manners, they called it discipline, but it was training, subtle, invisible, precise. You learned early that survival meant shrinking. That power belonged to the ones who never flinched when others begged. You learned to smile while swallowing rage, to praise the system that chained you. Every time you hesitated before speaking your truth, a piece of your soul was traded for approval. Every time you apologized for existing too loudly, you handed over another fragment of your fire. They built you like a machine, obedience in, silence out. The world fed you a diet of fear and politeness until you forgot the taste of your own voice. Schools taught you to memorize, not to think. Parents said, don't question. Bosses said, stay in line. And somewhere along the way, you mistook compliance for safety. You became predictable, easy to manage, easy to manipulate. They knew if they kept you busy chasing validation, you'd never look up to see who was holding the strings. The truth is, they never needed to cage you. They just needed you to believe you couldn't run. There's a reason rebellion feels holy. It's not arrogance, it's memory. Somewhere deep in your bones, you remember what it means to be untamed. But they buried that part of you beneath years of conditioning, beneath fear disguised as humility. They made you bow to systems that were never built for you, worship the opinions of people who never understood your fire. And every time you questioned it, they called you unstable, difficult, disrespectful. Because obedience keeps their empires standing, disobedience reminds them that their walls are paper thin. You were taught to mistake exhaustion for purpose, to chase achievement, not awareness, to serve without questioning the master. They told you the world would reward you if you played nice, but the reward was more chains, painted gold this time. They made you forget that power isn't given, it's taken. That freedom isn't found in following the path. It's carved in blood when the path doesn't exist. You were told to keep your head down, but look what they built above you. Towers made of your silence. And now, here you stand, staring into the mirror. For the first time you see it, the reflection staring back isn't weak, it's waiting. The obedience has cracks, and through them, something ancient bleeds out, a hunger, a remembering. The voice they buried starts whispering again, quiet but unbroken. You were never meant to kneel. You start noticing the lies you once repeated. You hear the commands you once obeyed, and they sound ridiculous now. You realize they weren't laws. They were suggestions enforced by fear. And fear only rules those who haven't met themselves yet. This is the moment your programming starts to fail. The illusion begins to glitch. You stop asking for permission to exist. You stop trying to fit into systems that were designed to keep you small. You begin to see obedience for what it truly is, a form of worship. But you no longer worship anything outside yourself. The mirror isn't a reflection anymore. It's a battlefield. On one side stands who you were trained to be: quiet, agreeable, forgettable. On the other stands what you were born to become: dangerous, precise, sovereign. And as the two meet in silence, something shifts. The old you pleads for comfort. The new you demands truth. The reflection flickers. The mask starts to crack. You feel the weight of 1,000 commands dissolve beneath your breath. You understand, finally, that obedience was the lie that kept you tame. And power, the kind that can't be taken, only awakened, has been watching you all along, waiting for you to stop bowing. You were programmed to obey long before you could even think for yourself. They taught you to lower your eyes when authority spoke, to nod when you disagreed, to chase approval instead of purpose. Every rule, every good job, every gold star was a chain polished, invisible, and worn with pride. You were rewarded for compliance, not courage. You learned to stay small, to stay safe. You were told that rebellion was dangerous, that silence meant peace, that suffering meant you were doing something wrong. But they lied, because your silence was their safety, your weakness was their stability, and your obedience, your precious, conditioned obedience, was the perfect tool for their control. They said, be patient. But patience became paralysis. They said, be humble. But humility became a cage for your potential. They said, don't make waves. But you were born to drown empires. They told you that life was about fitting in, staying polite, staying grateful for crumbs. And every time you hesitated, they smiled, because hesitation is the language of the powerless. You stopped questioning. You stopped feeling. You became the reflection of what they needed, not who you were. That's the quiet horror no one talks about. Not death, but decay while still breathing. But one night, when the world slept, something inside you cracked. Not from anger, but from truth. You realized the system wasn't broken. It was built this way. You saw the pattern. Obedience disguised as morality, submission dressed as virtue. You started noticing how everything that weakens the human mind is labeled normal. The 9 to 5 trance, the endless scroll, the constant noise that keeps you too distracted to look inward. They never wanted you to think. They wanted you to repeat. You were trained to perform, not to awaken. And yet you did. Now the grind begins, not the grind they sell you, but the one they fear, the kind that burns illusions. You start tearing out every false belief, every inherited lie, one by one. You start moving differently, sharper, quieter, colder. You stop reacting, you start calculating. Each day becomes an act of rebellion. You rebuild yourself in secret, no announcements, no validation. Just work, silent, surgical, unrelenting. You learn to use exhaustion as energy. You turn loneliness into leverage. Every scar becomes data. Every mistake becomes armor. You stop praying for lighter burdens and start training for stronger shoulders. You feel it, the shift. You no longer seek comfort. You seek clarity. You no longer chase pleasure. You chase purpose. The same world that once laughed at you now studies your silence with unease. They sense it, something ancient moving beneath your calm. The kind of focus that can't be manipulated. The kind of strength that doesn't shout. You realize you were never meant to fit in with them. You were meant to outgrow them, to see through their illusions and turn their programming into your power. The grind isn't about working harder. It's about burning the lies that made you obedient. It's about erasing the version of you they created and sculpting the one you were meant to become. You start speaking less, observing more. You learn that the loudest one in the room is usually the weakest. You move with intention, no longer reacting to chaos, but orchestrating it. You become fluent in silence, efficient in pain, addicted to evolution. you begin to understand the paradox. The more you detach, the more control you gain. The more you sacrifice, the freer you become. They will sense it, though they won't understand it. They'll call you cold, distant, ruthless. Let them. They can only name what they fear. And what they fear most is the one who escaped the system, the one who remembered who they were before the programming began, the one who stopped obeying and started becoming. They thought you were finished. They thought the crash was fatal, that the silence afterward meant defeat. But they never understood what kind of silence it was. It wasn't the sound of surrender. It was the stillness before ignition, when everything inside you turned to heat and every shattered piece of your past began to burn. You stopped asking why they did it, why they betrayed you, why the world was so cold. You stopped waiting for fairness. Instead, you built fire out of fury, and you learned that the most dangerous person alive is the one who no longer seeks approval. You began to operate in shadows. While they mocked, you planned. While they slept, you studied. You became the ghost of your former self, but sharper, faster, colder. You no longer wanted to be seen, you wanted to be felt. Every move now carried intention. Every hour became a weapon. You stripped away distractions, attachments, illusions of friendship. You began to understand power doesn't come from being loved. It comes from being unbreakable. And that realization didn't make you cruel. It made you precise. You stopped reacting. You started calculating. The fire inside you was no longer chaos. It was control. You burned clean. You purified everything false. Discipline became your religion. You prayed through repetition, blood through silence, and rose through pain. There were nights your body begged for mercy, but you smiled in the dark because you knew this was the price of rebirth. You stopped fearing exhaustion. You started craving it. You learned the strange truth the weak never understand, that pain, when embraced, becomes clarity, and clarity is the birthplace of power. Your reflection began to change. The softness disappeared, the hesitation gone. You started seeing what they always feared, a person who cannot be manipulated anymore, the kind who remembers betrayal but feels no bitterness, the kind who forgives no one but forgets nothing. You moved with the calm of someone who's already survived the worst. That terrified them, because you became the one thing they can't predict. Consistent, focused, and silent. They can't attack what doesn't react. There were moments of doubt, yes, nights when the weight was unbearable. But then you remembered who you used to be. Desperate for approval, fragile, always explaining yourself. That version of you died in the fire. Now, when they whisper your name, they lower their tone. They sense it, the shift in your energy, the sharpness in your eyes. You no longer radiate innocence. You radiate inevitability. You learn to weaponize isolation, to make solitude your sanctuary instead of your prison. Every betrayal became a brick, every scar a symbol. You built a fortress out of everything that once tried to destroy you, and from within those walls, you trained your mind like an assassin trains his blade, cutting through weakness, through noise, through the need to be understood. You realized that mastery isn't loud, it's quiet. It's the silence between your heartbeat and your next move. And when you finally stepped back into the world, you didn't announce your return. You didn't need to. The atmosphere changed. People could feel it. A gravity they couldn't name, a fire they couldn't see but couldn't escape. You spoke less. You listened more. Every word you said carried weight because it came from the furnace of experience. You no longer argued. You no longer chased. You let results speak in the language of thunder. They thought you'd break, but you didn't. You turned every wound into wisdom, every failure into strategy, every silence into signal. You learned that fire doesn't destroy the strong, it forges them. And now, when they see you, they don't see the person who fell. They see the one who walked through flames and came out wearing the smoke like a crown. You don't announce your return. You arrive quietly, the way storms do before anyone realizes the sky has changed. The same people who once watched you fall now lower their voices when your name slips into conversation. They sense it, the shift. The air bends differently around you now. You move with the weight of someone who's died before and crawled back from the dirt. There's no need for noise, no demand for recognition, because power doesn't explain itself. It simply exists and everyone adjusts. They thought you'd spend years proving them wrong, but you stopped caring about that long ago. Revenge lost its flavor once you realized they were never the enemy. your own weakness was. And that's the part you slaughtered. Every sleepless night, every ignored message, every mocking glance became the steel that reforged you. You learned the language of silence. You learned how to weaponize patience. While they were busy gossiping, you were building an empire brick by brutal brick. And now you stand in the ashes of their expectations, not with anger, but with something colder, clarity. You walk into rooms differently. No smiles, no explanations, just presence, the kind that unsettles even those who have nothing to fear. Because there's something unnatural about calm that comes after chaos, something ancient. They see it in your eyes, the memory of every fall, every betrayal, every moment you bit down on pain and turned it into fuel. You wear that silence like armor. You don't respond to whispers anymore. You make them obsolete. Power isn't about control, it's about restraint. You could destroy them with a word, but you don't. You let the results speak instead. The success they said you'd never reach now breathes down their necks. Your existence is their contradiction, and that burns louder than any insult ever could. You've become a mirror that forces them to see their own limits, their own cowardice. They called it arrogance when you dreamed too loud. Now they call it destiny because they can't name it without surrendering to it. Every step you take is deliberate. Every pause is strategy. You've learned the art of waiting like predators do when the forest sleeps. You don't chase opportunities, you create gravity. Things come to you now. Respect, fear, admiration, they orbit your silence. You speak less because you understand what your voice costs. You don't argue anymore, you calculate. You don't chase approval, you study behavior. You read intentions the way others read headlines. Because once you've been broken by betrayal, patterns become scripture. They still test you. That's the nature of small minds. They need to poke greatness to feel alive. But you don't react, you've evolved past the impulse to prove. Every jab is an echo, every insult a fossil. You've transcended their language. While they rehearse excuses, you refine your edge. While they reminisce about who you were, you become someone unrecognizable. You've built a mind that doesn't panic, a heart that doesn't beg, and a soul that doesn't flinch. You've turned survival into strategy, and still, you don't smile. Not because you're bitter, but because you understand. Every crown comes with silence. Every empire needs distance. They wouldn't understand the weight you carry, the ghosts you buried beneath your success. You've tasted the void and returned fluent in its dialect. Now when you walk through the same doors that once rejected you, even the air holds its breath. They see you not as a person, but as a reckoning. You don't need to remind them what they did. You are the reminder. Every calm glance, every slow nod, every effortless victory whispers the same truth they fear to admit. You didn't come back to prove them wrong. You came back to prove yourself inevitable. They never saw it coming. The moment you stopped fighting for attention and started moving in silence, you became the ghost in the machine, the one who no longer needs noise to feel alive. Once, your worth depended on being seen. Now their recognition feels small, like dust on armor you used to chase proof. Now, proof follows you. Your silence doesn't mean defeat, it's precision. You've learned that when kings whisper, entire empires lean closer. There was a time when you screamed just to be heard. Every word was a plea for validation from people who only applauded when you blawed. You thought noise meant progress. You thought presence meant power. But silence taught you more. It showed you that power doesn't announce itself. It waits, still and calculating, behind unblinking eyes. They mock the quiet because it terrifies them. Still waters, they say, run deep. But yours run dark, so deep that if they ever tried to measure them, they'd drown before they reached the bottom. Now, when you walk into a room, you don't seek to dominate. You distort the atmosphere. People feel it before they see it. The tension shifts, conversations dull, the air grows heavier. You don't need to prove anything. The proof lives in your posture, in the way your gaze lingers a second too long, reminding them of everything they once tried to destroy. Power doesn't speak, it observes, and you've become fluent in silence. Once, you were desperate for belonging. You carved yourself into shapes that pleased others, begging for a place at their table. Now you build your own halls, eat alone, and the echo of your footsteps sounds like prophecy. You stopped explaining your worth the day you realized explanation is a form of begging. Those who know see. Those who don't never mattered. Your detachment isn't coldness, it's control. You no longer react, you calculate. You've learned to play the long game, the one where patience isn't weakness but warfare. They called you emotionless, but that's not true. You just redirected your fire inward. What once burned in anger now forges strategy. Every scar became a line of code in your rebirth. They gave you silence as punishment, but you turned it into a kingdom. Every hour spent alone became a brick, every betrayal, a blade. You built a throne from the wreckage, and when you finally sat upon it, the ghosts of your past kneeled, whispering what they never dared to say. When you were beneath them, you won. Now, your calm terrifies them more than your rage ever did, because your silence isn't absence, it's potential. It's the sound before the storm, the breath before the strike. You don't chase revenge anymore. You've surpassed it. Revenge is loud, power is quiet. And the moment they realize you no longer care, that's when they lose their control. They try to define you, contain you, rewrite your story, but they never understood. You became the author the moment you stopped needing their ink. There's something ancient about your stillness now, something that feels older than your pain, older than their betrayal. The kind of silence that warriors carried after wars they weren't supposed to survive. You've mastered the art of vanishing while standing right in front of them. They search for the old version of you in your eyes, but it's gone, buried beneath layers of calm ruthlessness. You didn't rebuild yourself to be admired. You rebuilt to never collapse again. So now you walk alone, not lonely, but untouchable. You've stopped trying to prove you deserve the crown, because you've realized the crown was never the goal. The power lies in knowing you can take it off and still command the room. Your silence isn't empty, it's sacred. It's the quiet between lightning and thunder. And when they look at you now, they finally understand the truth. You didn't change the game. You became the game.